The clinking of dress uniform medals filled the officers' club as Captain Sarah McAllister adjusted her service ribbons one final time. Around her, 3 generations of military families gathered for the annual Veterans Day celebration, their conversations a mixture of war stories and gentle ribbing that only those who had served could truly understand. Her father, Colonel James McAllister, stood near the bar with his old infantry buddies, his chest heavy with combat decorations from 2 tours in Afghanistan. Sarah caught fragments of his familiar refrain drifting across the room as he gestured toward her with his bourbon glass. "Just flying around up there in her little jet," he said with that dismissive chuckle she knew so well. "Not like real soldiers who get their boots dirty in the mud and blood." The word stung deeper than any enemy fire she had faced in her 8 years of service. Sarah had learned to navigate through hostile airspace at 500 miles per hour, had pulled wounded Marines from behind enemy lines, had stared death in the face more times than she could count. Yet to her father, she was still just playing with expensive toys in the sky. "Where in the world are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there?" Share your location in the comments because military families are connected across every time zone on this planet. Sarah straightened her shoulders and walked toward the group of younger officers near the windows, their animated discussions about recent deployments a welcome relief from her father's casual dismissal of everything she had sacrificed for her country. The memory of flight school graduation day flashed through Sarah's mind as she watched her father's animated storytelling. She had been 22, standing on the tarmac in her crisp new uniform, the golden wings freshly pinned to her chest still catching the Texas sunlight. Her mother had tears of pride streaming down her face, but her father had simply shaken his head and muttered something about wasting taxpayer money on glorified bus drivers. Even then, when she had finished at the top of her class in advanced fighter training, when her instructors had called her a natural-born pilot with reflexes that couldn't be taught, he had remained unimpressed. "Real warriors fight with their feet on the ground," he had said during the family dinner that night. "Air Force is just support for the real military." Those words had followed her through every training exercise, every deployment briefing, every moment when she strapped herself into the cockpit of her F-16. The irony wasn't lost on her that while he dismissed her chosen path, she was often the one providing close air support for ground troops just like him, keeping infantry soldiers alive when they were pinned down by enemy fire. Have you ever had someone you love completely misunderstand what you do for a living? Drop a comment about a time when your family just didn't get your passion or profession. Sarah took a sip of her club soda and tried to focus on the present moment, but the familiar ache of seeking her father's approval never quite disappeared. The sandstorm had come from nowhere during her 3rd month in Afghanistan, turning the sky into a wall of brown fury that made flying nearly impossible. Sarah remembered gripping the controls of her F-16 as the radio crackled with desperate voices from a forward operating base under heavy Taliban fire. Ground troops were pinned down, taking casualties, and she was their only available close air support in a 100-mile radius. Most pilots would have turned back, waiting for the weather to clear before attempting such a dangerous mission. The visibility was less than a quarter mile, the winds were gusting at 40 knots, and enemy anti-aircraft positions were actively hunting for any aircraft brave enough or foolish enough to fly in such conditions. But Sarah had listened to the panic in the ground commander's voice, heard the automatic weapons fire crackling through his transmission, and made the decision that would define her career. She dove through the storm, using instruments alone to navigate through the chaos, and delivered precision strikes that allowed 18 Marines to escape an ambush that would have killed them all. When she called her father from the base phone that night, dusty and exhausted from the mission, he had barely listened to her account of the day's events. "Sounds like you had some weather up there, kiddo," he had said dismissively. "We had some real action down here today though, let me tell you about this convoy we escorted." The disconnect between her reality and his perception felt wider than the ocean separating them. 3 deployments later, Sarah's service record read like a catalogue of extraordinary achievements that most pilots could only dream of accumulating in an entire career. The Distinguished Flying Cross sat in her apartment alongside the Bronze Star with Valor, both earned for missions so classified that she couldn't discuss the details even with her closest friends. Her squadron commander had recommended her for promotion ahead of schedule, noting her exceptional performance under combat conditions and her natural leadership abilities. Yet every phone call home followed the same predictable pattern. Her father would spend 20 minutes detailing his latest training exercises with new recruits, describing the proper way to clear buildings and set up defensive perimeters, while Sarah listened patiently from whatever overseas base currently housed her F-16. When she finally got a word in about her own experiences, he would politely change the subject or offer generic responses that made it clear he wasn't really listening. The breaking point had come during her second tour in Iraq, when she had successfully completed a night rescue mission that saved the lives of 4 downed helicopter crew members behind enemy lines. The operation required flying at dangerously low altitude through a maze of surface-to-air missiles, using night vision equipment to locate the survivors and coordinate their extraction while under heavy ground fire. When she called to share the news that she had been recommended for the Air Medal, her father's response was typically underwhelming. "That's nice, honey," he had said. "Your mother wants to know if you're eating enough vegetables over there." The annual McAllister family military reunion had become Sarah's personal endurance test, and this year's gathering at Fort Bragg was no exception. 36 relatives in various stages of military service filled the base recreation center, their uniforms creating a patchwork of different branches and ranks across the crowded room. Sarah stood near the buffet table, watching her father hold court with his usual audience of cousins and uncles. "My daughter flies jets," he announced to the group with the same tone he might use to describe a hobby like stamp collecting. "Nice safe job up there above all the real fighting. Not like when we were boots on ground in Fallujah, getting shot at every day." The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow to Sarah's chest. She watched as her Uncle Mike, a decorated Marine sergeant, nodded in agreement while her cousin David, fresh from his first deployment as an Army medic, looked confused by the casual dismissal of her service. Her father continued his monologue, gesturing broadly with his beer bottle. "Air Force has got it made," he said with authority that only came from years of believing his own misconceptions. "Climate-controlled cockpits, fancy equipment, probably never even see the enemy except as little dots on a screen. Have you ever been in a room where someone completely misrepresented who you are and what you've sacrificed? Share your story in the comments because we've all felt invisible sometimes." Sarah felt her jaw clench as murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. The mission that haunted Sarah's dreams had happened 18 months earlier in Syria, though she could never speak its name aloud or share its details with anyone who lacked the highest security clearance. What she could remember, in vivid detail that therapy had failed to diminish, was the moment her radar detected 12 surface-to-air missiles launching simultaneously from hidden positions scattered across the desert floor. The special operations team she was supporting had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap, pinned down in a valley with no escape route while enemy reinforcements closed in from 3 directions. Their radio calls grew increasingly desperate as ammunition ran low and wounded soldiers began falling behind cover that was rapidly disintegrating under heavy machine gun fire. Sarah had made the decision in less than 3 seconds, diving her F-16 into what every tactical manual labeled a suicide run. She flew at treetop level through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire, her aircraft shaking from near misses that left holes in her wings and tail section. For 27 minutes, she provided continuous close air support while dodging missiles and ground fire, buying precious time for the extraction helicopters to reach the trapped soldiers. When does courage cross the line into madness? Drop a comment about a time when you or someone you know took incredible risks to help others, because sometimes heroes look like ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She had landed that night with hydraulic fluid leaking from multiple systems and her left engine running on fumes, but all 14 special operations soldiers had made it home alive. Sarah had returned from that deployment with a slight tremor in her left hand that appeared whenever she tried to sleep, and nightmares that jolted her awake at 3 in the morning with her heart pounding like rotor blades. The base psychiatrist had diagnosed it as combat stress reaction, a clinical term that felt too sterile to describe the weight she carried from watching tracer rounds streak past her canopy while knowing that 14 lives depended on her steady hands and split-second decisions. Her homecoming dinner at her parents' house had been a study in painful contrasts. While her mother fussed over her weight loss and the dark circles under her eyes, her father dominated the conversation with stories about his recent promotion to full colonel and his new assignment training junior officers. When Sarah finally worked up the courage to mention that she had been recommended for another medal, he barely looked up from carving the roast beef. "More hardware for the shadow box," he said with a dismissive wave of his knife. "You Air Force types sure do love your participation trophies. Not like the old days when medals actually meant something." The irony cut deeper than he could possibly understand. Sarah's recent commendation had come with a citation that remained classified at the highest levels, describing actions that had prevented an international incident while saving the lives of soldiers whose families would never know how close they had come to receiving folded flags. Her father's casual reference to participation trophies felt like a slap across the face of everything she had risked and sacrificed. That night, she had excused herself early and driven back to base in silence. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier on official Pentagon letterhead, requesting Captain Sarah McAllister's presence at a formal recognition ceremony to be held at Joint Base Andrews. The language was carefully vague, mentioning distinguished service and exceptional valor without providing specifics that might compromise ongoing classified operations. Sarah had read it twice before the significance fully registered, her hands trembling slightly as she realized this wasn't just another routine military function. Her commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, had been unusually tight-lipped when she asked for details about the ceremony. All he would say was that certain high-ranking officials had taken notice of her service record and wanted to publicly acknowledge contributions that had previously remained in the shadows of classification. The guest list, he mentioned casually, would include family members and distinguished veterans from all branches of the military. Sarah had called her parents that evening, her voice carefully neutral as she extended the invitation. Her mother had immediately started planning her outfit and asking about hotel arrangements, but her father's response had been predictably lukewarm. "Another dog and pony show," he had grumbled into the phone. "You know how these Air Force ceremonies go, all flash and no substance. But I suppose we should show up and smile for the cameras." Now, standing in the officers' club and watching him dismiss her career yet again, Sarah felt a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach about what the next few days would bring. The morning of the ceremony dawned crisp and clear at Joint Base Andrews, with autumn sunlight filtering through the windows of Sarah's temporary quarters as she carefully pressed her dress blues for the third time. Her hands moved with practiced precision over the fabric, but her mind raced with scenarios of how the day might unfold. She had attended dozens of military ceremonies over the years, but this one felt different in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Her parents had arrived the night before, her father making his usual rounds at the base officers' club where he seemed to know half the senior staff from various assignments over his 30-year career. Sarah had watched him work the room with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the military hierarchy, his combat patches and ribbons telling a story that everyone could read and understand. The contrast with her own experience felt more pronounced than ever. Her most significant achievements remained locked behind classification levels that prevented her from sharing details even with her own family. How do you explain the weight of saving lives when you can't describe the missions that put those lives at risk in the first place? How do you convey the reality of combat when your father sees only the sanitized version filtered through official reports and news briefings? Sarah adjusted her service ribbons one final time and took a deep breath, knowing that in a few hours everything would change, though she still had no idea exactly how or what the ceremony would reveal about her classified service record. The base auditorium filled slowly with the careful precision of a military formation, dress uniforms creating neat rows of blue, green, and khaki that stretched from the front of the stage to the back wall. Sarah sat in the designated honor section, her parents flanking her on either side while her father made quiet observations about the various generals and admirals filing into the front rows. He seemed impressed by the star power assembled for what he still assumed was a routine recognition ceremony. General Morrison stepped to the podium with the bearing of a man who had commanded respect on battlefields across 3 continents. His chest displayed ribbons that told the story of a warrior's career spanning 4 decades, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to judge courage under fire. The auditorium fell silent as he adjusted the microphone and opened a thick folder that Sarah suddenly realized contained her complete service record. Today we honor extraordinary valor that has remained hidden in the shadows of classification for too long, he began, his words echoing through the hushed space. We gather to recognize a pilot whose actions in combat have saved countless lives while operating in conditions that would challenge the most experienced warriors. Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she noticed her father leaning forward in his chair, suddenly paying attention with an intensity she had rarely seen outside of combat briefings. What emotions are you feeling right now as this moment approaches? Share in the comments because we're all holding our breath together. General Morrison's voice filled the auditorium with the weight of declassified truth as he began reading from Sarah's service record. Captain Sarah McAllister, he announced clearly, 1,000 combat missions flown over 8 years of continuous deployment across 4 theaters of operation. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Sarah watched her father's face transform from casual interest to stunned disbelief. The general continued with methodical precision, describing missions that Sarah had never been able to discuss with anyone outside of classified briefings. 300 close air support sorties protecting ground forces under fire. 200 reconnaissance flights over hostile territory. 57 combat search and rescue operations resulting in the successful extraction of downed air crew and special operations personnel behind enemy lines. Sarah felt her mother's hand grip her arm as the general's voice grew more intense, describing the night mission in Syria that had haunted her dreams. Captain McAllister flew through concentrated anti-aircraft fire for 27 minutes, sustaining multiple hits to her aircraft while providing continuous support that enabled the successful rescue of 14 special operations soldiers who would otherwise have been captured or killed. Her father sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open as the magnitude of his daughter's service record washed over him like a tidal wave of realization. This is the moment we've all been waiting for. Drop a heart in the comments if you're feeling the emotional impact of this father finally understanding his daughter's incredible sacrifice and heroism. The auditorium remained silent except for the general's unwavering voice detailing 8 years of extraordinary valor. The Distinguished Service Cross gleamed against Sarah's chest as General Morrison stepped back from the podium, but all she could see was her father's face crumbling under the weight of 8 years of misunderstanding. Tears streamed down the cheeks of the man who had dismissed her service as glorified taxi driving, his hands shaking as he finally understood the true cost of his daughter's dedication to protecting others. The auditorium erupted in sustained applause, but Sarah barely heard it over the sound of her father's voice as he leaned toward her. "I had no idea," he whispered, his words breaking with emotion. "All this time, I thought you were safe up there. I never knew you were saving lives, risking everything. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so incredibly sorry." Her mother sobbed openly as Colonel McAllister stood and saluted his daughter for the first time in her military career, his gesture drawing the entire auditorium to their feet in a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the building's foundation. The man who had spent years belittling her achievements now looked at her with a mixture of pride, shame, and overwhelming respect that transformed everything between them in a single moment. Later, at the reception, Sarah watched her father telling anyone who would listen about his daughter's 1,000 combat missions, his voice filled with the wonder of a man discovering that his child was a hero he had never recognized. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and underappreciated until the moment truth finally comes to light.